right. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I am Corrine with the Partnership for America's Children. And before we get started on today's webinar, just want to run through a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so I ask that you please mute your line so that we can make sure that we have a really nice sound quality for the recording. And the recording and a copy of these slides will be shared after the webinar with all registered participants. So thank you once again. And so please mute your line. You can do so using a *6 or the mute function on your phone. And I really hope that you enjoy today's webinar. We have a fantastic lineup. So please mute your lines. And Flo, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Great. Thanks, Polani. And thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon to learn more about the importance of the decennial census and the issues around the young child undercount. With us today, we have Corrine from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She is the Managing Policy Director and is spearheading the census efforts for the organization. We also have Bill O'Hare, who is the father of Kids Count. He has been doing Kids Count since the very beginning and is one of the premier experts on the undercount of young children. They're going to be discussing with you all the importance of the census, the challenges that are present at the moment to obtain a complete and accurate count. We'll also go through the issue of the undercount of young children and why we should really be concerned about that undercount, and end by providing you all with some resources so that you all can become more informed and involved on the issue. We're really looking forward to the presentation, and if you have any questions, please go ahead and jot them in the Q&A box, which is on the left side of your screen, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll just go ahead and pass it over to Corrine to get us started.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks to the Casey Foundation for all they're doing to support a fair and accurate census. And really thrilled to be on this webinar and thrilled, as always, to partner with Bill on it. For those who don't know the Leadership Conference, we are the nation's leading civil and human rights coalition with more than 200 organizations. And we are working, as Flo noted, on efforts directed toward the key decisions that Congress and the administration are making now that will have a profound impact on the accuracy of the 2020 census. Because the census is important to everyone. The census is the basis for virtually all demographic and socioeconomic information used by educators, policymakers, and community leaders like you. Census data directly affect representation in Congress and presidential elections. As you may know, every 10 years, census population counts are used to reapportion the 435 seats in the House of Representatives among the states, and then to draw legislative districts in the states. The number of electors each state receives for presidential elections is the number in its congressional delegation. In other words, the number of representatives in the House and Senate. Census data directly affects decisions made on all matters of national and local importance, including education, employment, veteran services, public health care, rural development, transportation, and I could go on and on and on. Many federal programs are statutorily required to use decennial data to develop, evaluate, and implement their programs. Federal, state, and county governments use census information to guide the annual distribution of hundreds of billions of dollars for critical services. The data are also used to monitor and enforce compliance with civil rights statutes, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and employment, housing, lending, and education anti-discrimination laws. So a good census counts everyone in the country, counts each only once, counts all in the right place. The consequences of a bad census are too serious to ignore. Disproportionately high undercounts that skew statistics for the next 10 years. But the census is at risk. The Census Bureau is working against the clock and is already behind. Congress must make sure that the Commerce Department and the Bureau have adequate funding now to bolster outreach and promotion activities, boost the number of partnership specialists hired, and have the proper footprint in the field. It's because insufficient, uncertain, and frequently late annual funding has already delayed and derailed important testing and preparations. These funding shortfalls threaten to shortchange operations needed to address hard-to-count populations. In addition, 2020 will see the first high-tech census. meaning that there will be an opportunity to respond to the census online, including through the mail and through the telephone. But while the internet and the online response option presents important opportunities, technology also brings cybersecurity threats, real or perceived, and the challenge of the digital divide. Without adequate funding, the Bureau has no means of testing these new technologies to determine their security and effective reach. In addition, fear of government authorities permeates some communities in every state and region, and disengagement from civic life in communities hit by drug epidemics also may affect the census. These are just some of the external factors working against a successful 2020 census. We do note that some problems could have been avoided. There's a lack of permanent Senate-confirmed top staff at the Census Bureau. I noted the delayed and generally insufficient annual funding throughout the research, testing, and planning phases. And finally, an 11th hour proposal to add an unnecessary and untested citizenship question to the 2020 census form. The census must count everyone well, including young children, and Bill is going to talk about why this is so important. Passing it on to you, Bill.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and talk about this topic, which I'm very interested in, obviously. I'm going to talk about 3 points over the next 15 minutes or so. The first is kind of what is the data and the evidence about the undercounted young children in the census. The second topic is why young children are missed at such a high rate in the census. And finally, what the implications of undercount for young children is. Why does it really matter that we have a high undercount of young children? This graph shows the net undercounts and overcounts in the 2010 census based on 5-year groups. And if you look at the far left-hand side of this graph, you see a bar that goes down to minus 4.6%. That is the net undercount of young children. By young children, I mean age 0 to 4. The net undercount of young children in the 2010 census, 4.6%. As you can see, if you look around the rest of the graph, it is much higher undercount than any other age group. In fact, the only other age group that has any appreciable undercount are children aged 5 to 9. So the point here is, if you look at who is missed in the census by age, young children stand out as like a sore thumb, for lack of a better word. And I think one of the points I would take from this is that if this is the age group that had the biggest errors, the biggest problems in 2010, it should be the focus of making sure we get it better or get it right in the 2020 census. So that's the main point of this slide, is that young children have a higher net undercount than any other age group by far. Sorry. This is a chart that shows the undercount of children from age 0. Age 0 is anybody less than age 1 in Census Bureau talk. So from age 0 to age 17. And there are 3 points I think are clear in this slide. The first one is one we just made, or I just made a minute ago, that on the far left-hand side of this graph, down where you have young children, there is a higher net undercount rate than any other age for children. The second point I would make is that if you look up for teenagers, basically 13 to 17, there's actually an overcount of children in that age group. And so the point here is that all children shouldn't be looked at the same in terms of their likelihood of being missed in the census, that young children are much different than older children in terms of a net undercount in the census. And the third point I'll make is that there's almost a perfect correlation between age and net undercounts as you go from age 0 to age 17, that it's an intriguing correlation there. Now, I've not seen anyone try and explain why that correlation exists, so I just throw it out for what it's worth. I also want to mention the age 0 part of this chart is probably wrong. There's some evidence that has come to light recently that suggests that probably isn't an accurate portrayal of the undercount of young children. I'd be happy to talk about that later if anyone's interested. I'm sure nobody in this audience is surprised to see that young Black and young Hispanic children have higher net undercounts than others. As I already mentioned, the net undercount for all young children is 4.6%. It's more like 6.5% for Blacks and for Hispanics. And that bar on the far left-hand side is my attempt to try and develop some measure for non-Hispanic whites. The Census Bureau does not produce an estimate of the net undercount for non-Hispanic whites, but this is the undercount for anyone who's not black or not Hispanic, which 90-some% are non-Hispanic white. The point is that Hispanic and black children are undercounted at a much higher rate than white children. I should mention here, before I move on, I guess, that there was a couple of papers presented at a conference last week that I happened to attend by the Census Bureau that revises some of the undercount estimates from 2010, but those are seen as experimental estimates and not official estimates like these are. So if you see something that's not consistent with these numbers, it probably comes from one of those experimental estimates that were released last week, by the Census Bureau. Okay, let's look at where young children are missed the most, where they have the highest net undercount. This shows all the counties. There's about 3,200 counties in the country. It shows them categorized by size, at the biggest counties being the far right-hand side, the smallest counties on the far left-hand side. And you can see for the counties of 500,000 or more, the collective net undercount for young children was 7.8%, much higher than the national average. So I think the point is clear here that large urban places tend to have higher net undercounts than other kinds of counties or places. This provides a little more specificity to this last point, that this is the top 10 largest counties in the country in 2010, and it shows the net undercount for each of those counties in the far right-hand column here. There is some variation across these counties, but they're all well above the national average, and almost all of them above 10%. It kind of underscores the previous slide that shows large counties, large places tend to have high net undercounts. And if I could just kind of digress for a minute, that if you combine this slide, the data from this slide, with the data about higher net undercounts for black and Hispanic, I think it's reasonable to expect that the net undercount for minority kids in large cities and large counties is much higher than the national average, and probably where we should be focusing our attention, or some of our attention, in the 2020 census to try and fix this problem of the high net undercount for young children. This is a slightly different way of looking at the same issue, but instead of looking at the undercount, we are looking at some data here about the number or the percent of young children, by that I mean age 0 to 4, who live in hard-to-count census tracts. And just to spend a second on this, hard-to-count census tracts were identified based on their mail return rate in the 2010 census. And the tracts that had the lowest mail return rate, the 20% lowest, were identified as hard-to-count tracts. And then we looked at the children, the number of children, percent of children in a place like Newark that lived in a hard-to-count census tract. And you can see in some of these big cities, the vast majority of children live in neighborhoods where they're likely to be difficult to enumerate. Again, this I think should help us figure out where we should focus our attention in the 2020 census and where the Census Bureau should focus its attention in the 2020 census. So that gives you kind of a brief overview of the results in the 2010 census, and I'm going to summarize those in a minute. But the one question, I guess, is, well, how does 2010 census compare to the past results? And this next slide shows that. The red dots or red squares are the net undercount for adults age 18 and over in every census since 1950. And the blue line are the net undercounts for ages 0 to 4 in that same set of censuses. And as you can see, from 1950 to 1980, there isn't a whole lot of difference between the census coverage of these two groups. In general terms, both of them improved between 1950 and 1980. But in 1980 or after 1980, there is a real divergence in these two groups. The undercount, the coverage, census coverage of adults continued to improve to the point that there were slight overcounts in 2000 and 2010. On the other hand, the net coverage for young children declined dramatically after 1980, so that now we have an undercount of 4.6% compared to about 1.5% in 1980. So the trajectory of these two age groups in terms of census coverage or census undercounts has varied a lot after 1980. And then, as I think I said a minute ago, the problem of the undercount of young children is getting worse. Another reason why we should focus on this group in the 2020 census. So let me say a word or two about why young children are missed in the census. First of all, I should just say that I don't think there's a consensus that there are many reasons young children are missed. There's no silver bullet or no single answer about what we could do to improve this, but there's no consensus on exactly which reasons are the most important. So there's some agreement amongst experts, but not agreement on everything. The other thing I want to point out is that an explanation for the high net undercount of young children must not only say why young children are missed, but it must say why they're missed at a higher rate than older children or adults. And for example, people have told me that young children are in immigrant families and immigrant families are hard to enumerate. Well, that's true, but older children are a higher share of kids in immigrant families than younger children. So that point really doesn't explain why young children are missed at a higher rate than older children or adults. One of the things that I think we have the best evidence on why young children are missed is because they're overrepresented in hard-to-count families and households. Down the left-hand part of this slide lists several characteristics which are widely believed to be associated with being hard to count or being undercounted in the census. And you can see in every one of those conditions or situations, young children, age 0 to 4, are more highly represented than older children. And so this is, I think, one reasonable explanation about why young children have a higher net undercount than older children is because of the kinds of families and households they live in. We can explore individual characters here if you want to, but let me just move on now and take up time. But the point is probably the explanation for which we have the most convincing evidence about why young children are missed so at such high rates is because they're concentrated in the kinds of families and households that are difficult to enumerate. Here's a couple other points, I guess, about the undercount of young children and why young children are missed at such a high rate, that some of them are left off census questionnaires that are returned, and some of them live in households that never returned a census questionnaire. The exact ratio of those two things is not exactly clear, but in some research done by the Census Bureau a year or two ago, they have some caveat, but let me just tell you, they looked on them. It's too complicated. Let me just tell you the bottom line. About 85% of the young children that were missed in this sample they looked at in 2010 were living in households that received a census questionnaire. So it's not like a lot of young children are living in households that are not on the Census Bureau's master address file, the ones who are going to get a questionnaire. So that's the portion of young children missed for that reason are relatively small. On the other hand, about half of young children missed in the 2010 census lived in a household where everyone was missed or undercounted and not included in the census questionnaire. So the point is the exact ratio of being missed because you're left off a census questionnaire and being missed because your household didn't return a census questionnaire is complicated. Here's a couple other reasons I'll just mention that people put forward, and I think experts have some agreement on, that children living in complex households are more likely to be missed. By that, they typically mean either not a married couple family or a single parent with a child and no one else in the household. The number or share of households that are complex has been growing, and they're much higher in the minority community than they are in the non-Hispanic white community. And so that kind of makes sense as to why young children living in those households are likely to be missed. One example I'll give you of that people have put forward is that imagine a couple in their 50s who have their 24-year-old daughter or son living at home with them with a young child, a 2-year-old. And when the 50-year-olds are filling out the questionnaire, they may not think their daughter and their grandchild is part of their household or living there. And in fact, a lot of times it's unclear how long that daughter and grandchild will be there, or they think they'll only be there for a short period of time and don't think they should be put on the census questionnaire. It's just one example of the kinds of possibilities of young children being missed in complex households. There's also pretty good evidence that children other than biological adopted, particularly grandchildren, are more likely to be left off census questionnaires. And one of the concepts that's used by the Census Bureau in the context of the census is usual place of residence. And you can imagine some young children who get moved around from household to household over time, who really don't have a usual place of residence and may be missed or not reported in the census because of that. There's also some speculation and thought, I guess, that some respondents may not report their child to the government because they don't want to. The latest data I've seen says there's about 1.5 million young children who live with at least one undocumented parent. And if you follow the news about the census, this addition of the citizenship question is going to make those young children even more vulnerable to being missed in the 2020 census, given all of the changes in the environment that have gone on in addition to the addition of the citizenship question. Another example of this is a grandchild may be living with a grandparent who's in some kind of restricted housing unit where they're not supposed to have a young child. So the grandparent may leave the young child off the form because they don't want to report to the government that they have a young child living there in the household. There's also some evidence that some respondents don't think the Census Bureau wants young children included in the census. So that may be another reason why young children are missed at higher rates than others. Let me say a word or two about why the net undercount of young children is important. And one could spend a lot of time talking about the uses of the census and the implications of young children not being fully counted. This is just a list of some of the uses of census data that probably aren't surprise to many of you. Some of them are kind of geeky, like population projections and using census data for weighting samples, but they have big implications. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to put them up here to give you a sense of how widespread the use of census data are. And when there's errors, like the undercount of young children, it has implications. I do want to talk about the extent to which census data are used to drive federal funding formulas. There's a couple of statistics that you may see floating around. One is $675 billion each year based on Census Bureau data. Another one by Andrew Reamer, it should be Reamer, I guess, rather than Reamer. Sorry about the typo. It says $589 billion each year for the 16 large programs based on census-derived data. And there's a couple points I want to make about this data that Andrew Reamer and Counting for Dollars generated. In fact, if you want more information on this, Google Counting for Dollars, and you can see a lot of information there, including state-specific numbers. But of the 16 largest programs that use census-derived data to distribute money, 8 of those are focused on children, and 2 others, Medicaid and SNAP, children are disproportionately large. So the point here is that in terms of data-driven federal funding, an accurate count for young children is more important than an accurate count for other populations. The bottom line, as I put down here, is when you miss kids, you get less money. The one estimate from Andrew is that for certain programs, an undercount would result in $1,200 for each missed person per year. There's some caveats to that, but I think first of all, there's no definitive estimate of exactly how much a state or locality would miss given undercount of a person. But I think the ballpark that has come up several times is about $1,000 per person per year. So that gives you some sense of the financial cost for a state or locality when young children are missed. This is a table from the Counting for Dollars, and I've highlighted here in bold all the programs that either have disproportionately large number of children or are children's programs. And you can see the numbers are significant, billions and billions of dollars. So when you miss children, the state and locality don't get their fair share of these resources. And I think it's also fair to say that the children who are missed are typically the ones who need these resources the most. Minority and poor children are the ones most likely to be missed, and they're the ones most likely to be in need of this kind of safety net program. So it's a kind of a double whammy, as the kids who need it the most are the most likely not to get it. So let me summarize here. The first point, I hope everybody's clear, is that young children have a higher net undercount than any other age group in the 2010 census. Black and Hispanic children are undercounted at a higher rate than others. Young children in large counties and large urban areas are undercounted at a higher rate than others. The net undercount of young children has been increasing since 1980, increasing at a pretty dramatic rate, which suggests that it should be a focal point of attention in the 2020 census. There are many reasons why young children are missed in the census, and there are many uses of census data, including distribution of trillions of dollars over a decade, which means that undercounted young children have important fiscal implications. So let me turn it back over to Corrine at this point.
Thanks, Bill. So we've just presented a whole lot of information and a whole lot of threats that may come together to form a perfect storm, but it is not too late. There are many things that we can do to ensure a fair and accurate census. So first of all, I just wanted to underscore that in 2 years, the 2020 census will be in full swing. Before then, the Bureau must put the field infrastructure in place, finish all testing, finalize the design and operations based on the results, verify the master address list that defines the census universe, develop an effective advertising and outreach campaign, ensure that all IT systems will support the first high-tech census, and that they are secure and that they work well. So that means that the Bureau needs a significant funding ramp-up and receive the money on time for the next 2 years to ensure a fair and accurate census, which is one that counts all communities equally well. Here I've set forth what stakeholders are asking Congress to allocate: $4.735 billion for the Census Bureau in FY 2019. So this is really important. I think is maybe the most important issue that we are working on to ensure a fair and accurate census. But in addition, Congress needs to exercise robust oversight over the census. Congress has a constitutional role in this area, and that oversight includes holding hearings on census operations, and importantly, on Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross's decision to include a new citizenship question in the 2020 census. We need you to join national, state, and local groups that are already helping to shine a spotlight on the operational decisions and public rhetoric that will compromise a successful count in hard-to-count communities. And as Bill noted, young children are considered to be a hard-to-count community, and that these funding shortfalls and this 11th hour edition of a question are going to put the counting of those hard-to-count populations at risk. So here are just a few ways that you can get involved. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and the Leadership Conference's Census Task Force meets every month to talk about census policy developments. And you can join the Census Task Force by emailing me at u@civilrights.org. If you're outside the Beltway, we urge you to join the Leadership Conference's Kitchen Cabinet, which includes state groups and state affiliates of national organizations. And you can join the Kitchen Cabinet by emailing Sergio Lopez at lopez@civilrights.org. Finally, please check out the Leadership Conference's website for resources at civilrights.org/census. We've got fact sheets and research on hard-to-count populations by state, including young children, thanks to Bill, our partnership with Bill O'Hare. And we also have new research from Andrew Reamer, who has updated his federal programs research to now encompass the top 300 federal programs whose funding depends on census data. And I would encourage you to go to our website, where we have an explainer document that just tells you what Andrew's research means, how best to use it. Finally, we've got fact sheets on the citizenship and legal status issues, and also on census confidentiality. So just in conclusion, I wanted to note, and I'll say it, I said it before and I'll say it again. If the census isn't fair and accurate, our most vulnerable communities will be robbed of representation and needed resources for years to come. That includes young children. There are no do-overs when it comes to the census. We've got to get this right. And with that, I'll turn it over to Flo for any questions that you might have.
Great. Thanks, Corrine and Bill. So we have a question from Terry Haven in Utah. She asks, can we get copies of the slides? yes. We'll be posting the recording of this presentation as well as the slides on KidsNet once we have them available. And if anybody else has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the question and answer box. Bill, I had a question about the undercount of young children. You mentioned that the undercount has grown between 1980 and 2010. Do you know why that occurred?
No, I've not heard anybody really address that. I've not seen anything. I guess a couple of possibilities that I've heard discussed that make some sense. One is we know that young Hispanics have higher net undercounts, and the Hispanics have become a larger share of young children. I think that's probably one possibility, but I don't think it explains the big increase by a long shot. The other possibility that fits in the same category, I guess, is increasing complexity of families and households in this country. That kids who live in complex households and complex families are more likely to be missed in the census, and the fact that a bigger share of young children live in those kinds of living arrangements may also partly explain the increase, but I don't find either one of those very fulfilling explanations.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Nancy Wagman from Massachusetts. She's wondering if you could explain the relationship between the census count and the estimates that come from the CPS and the ACS.
There are several linkages there, but probably the most important one is the fact that when the Census Bureau produces its yearly estimates, population estimates, they start with the decennial census and then add births and deaths and migration. So if a group is missed in the census, that group is going to be underrepresented in the population estimates that are produced for the decade. And the importance of that is that when the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey, or frankly any other survey, gather their sample statistics, the way they inflate them to become national data is by using the population estimates as controls. So if a group is underestimated because they were undercounted in the census, they're going to be underestimated in the CPS and the ACS sample estimates. One example of that is poverty, that if a fully counted population estimate had been used for the ACS poverty in 2010, the poverty rate for young children would have been significantly higher. So the point is that the biggest connection is that post-census population estimates that are used for weighting samples rely on the decennial census.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Amy Swan. She's wondering if will households only get a paper copy of census mailed to them if they don't complete it online within a certain period of time? She's asking because there are still areas in Kentucky that are without reliable internet coverage.
Let me take a stab at this, and Corrine can correct me. My understanding is that that people who live in areas with lower or no internet access will initially get a mailing from the Census Bureau that includes a paper questionnaire. Those who live in the other 80% of the country where there is internet access won't initially get a paper questionnaire, but can request one later on. So if the question is, will they get a paper questionnaire? If they live in an area where low internet access, they will get a paper questionnaire initially.
I think that's right, Bill.
Thanks.
And
but just to add on that, there still is I think, a reasonable concern that places and households who don't have the kind of regular internet access that a lot of us have may be more likely to be missed in this census because of the push of the Census Bureau to get people to respond on the internet?
Well, it is my understanding that sometime in mid-April, all homes that didn't self-respond, so respond to the initial push, will get a reminder letter from the Bureau and a paper form. So there will still be chances for people to respond, even if they didn't in the initial run.
Great. And Helen is wondering, how do you know there is an undercount? And if you know that, why can't the count just be adjusted accordingly?
Good question. Let me do a little bit of Census 101. I guess there's two methods that the Census Bureau uses to assess the undercounts and overcounts in the census. The first one, which they've been doing since 1950 and which I used almost exclusively, is called demographic analysis, or DA in shorthand. And that method looks at birth and death and net immigration statistics to give an estimate of how many people they expect the census to count in each race, age, sex category. So based on the fact that there were about 22 million births in the 5 years before the census and hardly any deaths and very little immigration, the Bureau expected to find 22 million young children in the 2010 census, but only counted 21 million. So that's how they determined there was a net undercount from that. The other method, which really doesn't work very well for young children, is called, well, it's called dual system estimates, but in 2010 it had the name CCM, Census Coverage Measurements. The names are probably not really important, except to note that it's changed every year, every decade at the Census Bureau. But the idea is pretty simple, that after the census is done in like August of 2010, the Census Bureau went back out to a sample of blocks and re-interviewed people with the best interviewers they could find. Then they compared the results of that, it's called a post-enumeration survey, to the results of the census to determine who was missed and who was undercounted, double counted. So that's how they measure the undercount. They can't apply an adjustment factor. They shouldn't apply an adjustment factor because it varies dramatically across places, so you wouldn't know what adjustment factor to use.
Great, thanks, Bill. And Laura has a question for you, Corrine. She's wondering what's happening right now in states with the kitchen cabinet groups, and then what role can kids advocates play?
Sure. So, I'd mentioned our kitchen cabinet, which is made up of groups with reach in the states. At this point in our census public education advocacy, we're in a phase where we are urging policy improvements, such as increased funding or robust oversight. So that we are hoping that kids advocates can help join this effort if they aren't already part of it, and I know several are already part of it, reaching out to their state and local officials, to other policymakers to ensure full funding, and because it's always good for policymakers to hear from their constituents. With respect to the citizenship question, there will be an opportunity for the public to weigh in, and I can give more details at a later time about how the public comment period will work. But this is a good opportunity to hear from the public about why they think the addition of the citizenship question is a terrible decision. And so I think there are lots of ways to plug in, but the best way initially is to get connected with my colleague Sergio. We've got monthly calls. We'll have a webinar coming up on the nuts and bolts of the census. So there's just a lot of resources and action items that we can offer folks.
Thank you. Would Sergio be able to connect the child advocacy organizations interested in engaging in the census with the core groups within their states who are working on that?
Yep. He can absolutely do that.
Great. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. Bill, I was wondering if you knew what the Bureau's plans were to tackle the undercount of kids. I know that they just received additional funding, and previously other things took priority over tackling the undercount. But I was wondering if you had heard anything from them.
I've heard there's a couple of things I can mention that have happened or will happen, I guess, that are promising. And just to put this in a little more better framework, I guess, in my mind, there's two avenues that could be used here. One is the census operation, that is how the census is actually taken and the questionnaire and those kind of things. And the other is kind of the outreach of how can we get people to respond to the census appropriately. So on the operation side, they are training, when someone doesn't send their questionnaire back in or do it online, the Census Bureau sends out a census enumerator to get information from that household. In 2010, we know that young children were more likely missed in those households where enumerators had to go out to get information. So the Bureau is including special training for those enumerators in 2020 to make them more sensitive about the possibility of young children being missed. That's one part of the operations. There's also, in the 2020 questionnaire, there are some things called probes where they ask if anybody was left out of the list of people here who sometimes lives here. That's been changed a little bit to make it more focused on children and young children and foster children and so on. So that's a couple of things on the operations side. On the outreach side, I think there is an awareness of the undercounted young children as a big issue in the partnership program and the outreach program. I think there is has been some effort to reach out to those groups or vice versa for us to connect with them. And I'm optimistic, I guess, or hopeful, I'm not sure which, that we can build some robust connections between the kinds of groups that have connections with households with young children, like child care, like pediatricians, on a regular basis, and government programs, I guess, like WIC and SNAP and so on, Tana, that we can use those channels to communicate to households to make sure all young children are included in the census.
Great, thank you. So I don't see any additional questions from participants. I wanted to let folks know that, well, the undercount of children is extremely important to the foundation. We are putting a report out in June that will focus on the undercount of young kids. The report will include data on children living in hard-to-count communities, as well as the funding research that Bill mentioned in the presentation. And we just wanted to let you all know that this was an issue, and it's something that we should all be focused and care about. And after this webinar, we are planning additional webinars, one to highlight the work that our Kids Count and Partnership for America's Children organizations have done around the census, and once the communications research that NALEO, Asian Americans in Advancing Justice, and Color of Change have done, once they have some findings to share, we're planning on organizing a communications webinar so that you all know what messages work with different communities. So hopefully you found the webinar useful. If you have any additional questions that pop in your mind as you go back to your offices or to your work, please feel free to reach out to me. Email is fgutierrez, GUTIERREZ @aecf.org, and I'm happy to answer those questions or at least point you to people who can. So thank you all for participating. Thanks, Bill and Corrine, for sharing your expertise, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.